both during and after its 7-season run. Star Trek Deep Space Nine has been set apart from the rest of the Star Trek franchise. Whereas other Star Trek shows have had great crossovers and reference each other constantly, Deep Space Nine has, for the most part, stood alone. With its more mature themes, political intrigues, seasons-long arcs, and space station setting, Deep Space Nine was always going to be different from more episodic and adventuresome shows like Star Trek, The Next Generation, or Star Trek Voyager. It's hardly surprising Deep Space Nine is something of an outcast from Star Trek. Despite this distance, however, Deep Space Nine has always been a fan favorite, with some of the best episodes in all of Star Trek. Indeed, some of the same darker themes and more dramatic storylines that make Deep Space Nine so great have also set it apart from the rest of the franchise. So despite its beloved status, Deep Space Nine remains at a distance from the rest of the Star Trek franchise. When Star Trek Deep Space Nine first aired, it was, in many ways, under the shadow of earlier installments of the Star Trek franchise. In the same way that early episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation felt more like Star Trek, the original series, early episodes of Star Trek Deep Space Nine felt similar to TNG. As early as the start of Season 2, DS9 began to focus more on its defining themes of religion and politics. And by the end of Season 3, Deep Space Nine had the first cliffhanger finale in Star Trek. As Star Trek Deep Space Nine progressed, becoming more and more focused on the Dominion's war with the United Federation of Planets and political intrigue, it drifted further and further from the optimistic utopia of the rest of Star Trek. In many ways, Deep Space Nine challenged Gene Roddenberry's vision for Star Trek. The crew of Deep Space Nine clashed in ways that never would have flown in other series. Furthermore, from the beginning, Commander Benjamin Sisko, Avery Brooks, clashed with Captain Jean-Luc Picard, Patrick Stewart, symbolically setting Deep Space Nine at odds with Star Trek The Next Generation. The few crossovers Star Trek Deep Space Nine did have only highlighted the distance between the show and the rest of the franchise. When Jonathan Frakes appeared on DS9, he did so as Thomas Riker, Maquis Rebel, rather than as Commander Will Riker. When Lieutenant Commander Worf Michael Dorn became a show regular, he brought very little from Star Trek The Next Generation, leaving behind his controversial romance with Counselor Troi, Marina Sirtis, and his son. Even Chief Miles O'Brien, Cole Meany, spoke very little about his time on the USS Enterprise D. On the whole, these connections ironically did little to change DS9's outsider status. Even now, 30 years later, Star Trek Deep Space Nine is still set apart from the rest of the franchise. Whereas the rest of 1990s Star Trek is referenced and revisited constantly, DS9 has had to make do with the odd Easter egg. Star Trek Strange New Worlds and Star Trek Discovery take place in the same era as Star Trek, the original series, and share characters and plots freely. Star Trek Picard is a continuation of TNG in the same way Star Trek Prodigy continues from Voyager. The only modern show with significant crossovers with Deep Space Nine is Star Trek Lower Decks. There are multiple episodes where characters from DS9 appear on screen, including the canonization of relationships only hinted at in the 90s. Ensign Mariner, Tawny Newsome, served on Deep Space Nine before Star Trek Lower Decks began, and Lieutenant Shaxs, Fred Tatasciore, was friends with Colonel Kira Nerys, Nana Visitor, in the Bajoran Resistance. But Star Trek Lower Decks' finale means that we are unlikely to see any more crossovers between the two shows.